Ask the average educated person what the Doctrine of Discovery is, or how it applies to life in the United States, and you will likely get a baffled reply. But this early modern doctrine, emanating from a series of papal pronouncements at the dawn of the European age of exploration, stands behind many colonial establishments and retains a disturbing legal legacy in the United States. The doctrine came about because of competition between the two Iberian leaders in maritime navigation, Spain and Portugal. As the two kingdoms sent ships out into the Atlantic during the 15th century, new claims and conquests were made by each kingdom. Spain would invade and conquer the Canary Islands, while Portugal took both Madeira and the Azores. Eventually, both countries would begin to look south toward the African Atlantic coast, and this would set the stage for possible colonial conflicts regarding access to and hegemony over coastal regions of Africa. In 1452 and 1455, Pope Nicholas V issued papal bulls granting Portugal the right to claim lands along the West African coast and to enslave non-Christian Africans. Such rulings by the Pope gave legitimacy to Portugal's early colonial ventures and were duly noted by officials in Spain. When Spanish ships reached the Western Hemisphere in 1492, vast new regions seemed open to colonialism. But with lands being claimed on behalf of the two Iberian powers, conflict was inevitable. It was with this in mind that court diplomats turned to the Vatican to arbitrate on the issue of potential colonial footholds and the right to foreign riches. The result was Pope Alexander VI's papal bull, which established the infamous line of demarcation, dividing the globe on an east-west axis between Spain and Portugal. A year later, the Treaty of Tordesillas would adjust that line in favor of the Portuguese, which allowed for their claims over the region that would become Brazil. As a result of these rulings and treaties, countless millions of humans and their respective societies and nations were said to be rightfully under the control of two Christian kingdoms on the Iberian Peninsula. The Church's rationale for such a grand gesture was that these declarations would ultimately thwart paganism and extend the sway of Christendom in the West amidst the rise of the Ottoman Empire in the East. Collectively, the rights granted by these papal bulls to Christian monarchs became known as the Doctrine of Discovery. The doctrine offered the patina of legality to European conquests in the Americas and elsewhere, and allowed for the forced conversion of whole populations of non-Christians, or, should they resist, their conquest and enslavement. Before the papal bulls articulating the doctrine of discovery as a justification for Christian colonization of foreign lands, the de facto right of conquest was all that was needed to justify the forceful acquisition of territory or even whole realms by a stronger power. The Norman Conquest was the result of a dynastic dispute between aristocratic houses over competing claims on the English throne. As such, the Norman victors required no elaborate justification. Successive Norman rulers attempted further conquest on the British Isles by invading the neighboring realms of Wales, Ireland, and Scotland, all with mixed success. The Anglo-Norman invasion of Ireland began roughly 100 years after the Norman Conquest, in 1169, but now reputedly armed with a papal justification known as the Lauda Biletter, a bull issued by Pope Adrian IV, the only English pope. English church leaders in Rome at the time had described the Irish as a barbaric and impious people, thus in need of English oversight and reform. With the blessing of an English pope, thus began the long and painful struggle of the Irish for self-rule. English hegemony over Ireland was piecemeal at best throughout most of the medieval period. But the region known as the Pale, surrounding Dublin, provided England with a land base from which they would attempt to expand. Other portions of Ireland were under the control of Anglo-Irish lords loyal to the English king, though frequently the sites of uprisings and rebellions. It was in this atmosphere that the Tudors launched their invasion of Ireland in 1536. The island was to remain in a state of conflict on and off until 1603. And it was in this period that we see English notions of settler colonial policy come into being. Rather than simply defeating their Irish enemies, the English pursued a policy of planting English and Scottish emigres on Irish lands. During the Desmond rebellions of Elizabeth I's reign, the English practiced a scorched earth policy, all in the name of pacifying and civilizing the native Irish. One English participant in the colonization of Ireland was the poet Edmund Spenser, who was also in Ireland during the rebellions. His 1596 political pamphlet, A View of the Present State of Ireland, has become infamous for its advocacy of colonial brutality in the suppression of Irish sovereignty. The pamphlet, in the form of a humanist dialogue, describes the supposed barbarity of the Irish and the need to extinguish their laws, customs, religion, and language. Spenser sets out to portray the Irish as a brutish people in need of civilizing colonial rule, even as he advocates starving them to death to lessen their numbers, forcing them to learn English in order to assimilate them to their conqueror's culture, and converting them to the Protestant faith. The dual projects of civilizing and salvation would become numbingly familiar justifications for most European colonial ventures. In 1496, an English expedition under the authority of King Henry VII sent Giovanni Cabot, also known as John Cabot, to explore the northeast coast of North America and claim it on behalf of England, so long as it did not interfere with Spanish or Portuguese claims. The letters of patent issued by the Crown followed the precedent set by the Doctrine of Discovery and allowed England to establish its claims to Newfoundland and the fishing banks of what is now Atlantic Canada. Once established, this means of justifying the seizure of lands and the enslavement of peoples in distant territories was deployed by various European nations, whether or not they had a papal bull specifically giving them permission to do so. To be Christian and to be civilized were taken to be the same thing, and so all societies that lacked one quality were seen as lacking both, thus justifying the imposition of colonial rule. Even after the Protestant Reformation, when many kingdoms denied papal authority outright, the guiding principles underpinning the Doctrine of Discovery continued to be invoked by Protestant powers in their own colonial ventures. Thus the English, the Dutch, and the Swedes, though all thoroughly Protestant by the 17th century, still invoked their status as Christian and civilized as having preemptive authority over the polities they would encounter in the Americas, Africa, Asia, and Oceania. This authority, claimed by European powers, meant that peoples indigenous to a place that did not practice Christianity, and thus were not recognized as civilized, had no right to title over their lands. It was simply acknowledged that they occupied them, but in the face of true religion, and the civilization of which it was part, native nations had no inherent rights. Thus, complex societies such as the Aztecs or Incas could be utterly destroyed in the name of Christian civilization. Likewise, because Christianity was co-opted as a solely European faith, it became enmeshed with the roots of white supremacy. Once racialized, the Doctrine of Discovery was even more toxic to those deemed racial others. In fact, by 1726, the Anglo-Irish author Jonathan Swift satirized the template of European colonialism in the conclusion of Gulliver's Travels, writing, "Here commences a new dominion, acquired with the title by divine right. Ships are sent with the first opportunity, the natives driven out or destroyed, their princes tortured to discover their gold, a free license given to all acts of inhumanity and lust, the earth reeking with the blood of its inhabitants. In this execrable crew of butchers, employed in so pious an expedition, is a modern colony, sent to convert and civilize an idolatrous and barbarous people." The legacy of the doctrine lies in the fact that many people have internalized its presumptions without any knowledge of the doctrine's existence. American school children are not asked to consider whether Europeans had the right to take lands of others. It is presumed, perhaps passively, that Europe's civilizing mission was its justification. The Doctrine of Discovery also found its way into American law at the highest levels. In Johnson versus McIntosh, a landmark case that came before the U.S. Supreme Court in 1823, the court was asked to adjudicate a case where both parties claimed ownership of the same piece of land. Johnson's party claimed to have purchased it directly from the Pankashaw Nation, while the McIntosh party claimed to have received it from a government land patent. The court, in essence, had to resolve who had rightful title to the land and therefore could sell it. Chief Justice John Marshall's ruling was unprecedented in U.S. law because he drew on the Doctrine of Discovery to deny Aboriginal title to lands in the United States. By Marshall's peculiar logic, the various colonial powers inherited the authority of the doctrine and could enforce it when they made a discovery. He reasoned that the English were the true discoverers of what would become the United States, and therefore when the United States became independent, it inherited the right from England. This piece of judicial legerdemain has remained one of the cornerstones of federal Indian law ever since. As recently as 2005, in the city of Sherrill versus the Oneida Indian Nation of New York, the Supreme Court ruled against the Oneida's attempt to regain their traditional lands based on a number of factors, including the Doctrine of Discovery, cited in a footnote in the court's written decision, authored surprisingly by Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. What many people might presume is an obscure piece of Renaissance-era religious doctrine, the Doctrine of Discovery, infiltrated the United States legal system and exercises judicial authority to this day.